Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. I'm excited to be here and share with you some great information. I have two outcomes today. The first outcome is I want to share with you some good information. The second outcome is I want to motivate you to take at least one or two actions that you already probably know about, and maybe even another action that you haven't learned about. So just a few cheerful facts to consider. At this point, we are in the midst of the worst chronic disease epidemic in the history of mankind. Right now, about 1 billion people suffer from diabetes and obesity. 1 billion. Obesity in our children has basically quadrupled over the past 30 years. Right now, 1 in 5 children, 20% of our children aged 6 to 11 are obese. $600,000 people in the United States die of heart attacks each year. It is the #1 cause of death right now. Does anyone know what AI stands for? Not artificial intelligence, autoimmunity. 1 in 4 women, and 1 in 6 men are being diagnosed with autoimmune disease. And most of those happen in the 40s and 50s, sometimes even in the 60s. It takes about 4 to 5 solid decades to really develop a good autoimmunity. So that's why most people are diagnosed at those ages. Right now, about half of the population take prescription drugs. Half of the adult population. 40% of the elderly take more than 5 medications. And I see many people over 65 that take more than 12 medications in my practice every day. 90% of our adult population takes at least some over-the-counter drug on a regular basis. But how does that affect the unborn? Well, back in 2000, I graduated from chiropractic school in 1998. I went to school in St. Louis, Missouri, and 2 years after, they did a study, and they found that the prevalence of autism, according to the CDC, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, showed that at that point it was 1 in 150 children. As of 2015, it's now increased its rate to 1 in 59 children. 1 in 59 children are being born with autism. Now, a lot of the kids that are autistic aren't reproducing. And so it's not that those genes are just getting passed along. There's some other confounding factor. We have to figure out what that is. The number of people diagnosed with depression is increasing 20% every year. Now, with all that good news I just gave you, unfortunately, things are going to get worse. At this point, a recent study they did, NIH and CDC, they found that the generation of children now, these 0 to 10-year-olds, it's going to be the first time in history, as we've known it, modern history at least, that our children will have a shorter lifespan expectancy than their parents. First time. So, if everything continues just how it is, at this rate, in 2 decades, 95% of Americans will be overweight. 95%. 1 in 3 will have diabetes. At this point, 9.4% of the U.S. population has diabetes. 30 million Americans have diabetes or prediabetes right now. So what does that have to do with the finances that we have to deal with, government, politics? It costs about $250 billion a year in just the United States to fund and treat diabetes. It's pretty profound. If you look at how much they're estimating it costs to treat Alzheimer's, $203 billion per year. It's going to expected to increase to about 1.2 trillion by the year 2050. So in about 30 years, 31 years or so, it's going to cost 1.2 trillion. Where is this money going to come from? Well, we don't know. What was it going to cost if there's been estimates about what it would take to just end world hunger forever? It would only cost $200 billion. So let me ask you a question. We have a mix of some younger adults, some more wise adults. This is a participation part of the talk. At this point, I just want to ask you, you have to choose one or the other. Okay, I'll give you the two choices, then you raise your hand and you tell me which door you choose. I don't know which one is which, but there's just two choices. So I always do this survey informally, and I always get the same result, but I'm just curious if you guys are like all the other humans I've spoken to in the past. So, well, before I do your survey, my son asked me the other day, he's 15, Zach, he says, Dad, would you rather know how you're going to die or where you're going to die? Or when you're going to die? How are you going to die or when you're going to die? I'm like, well, yeah, I want to know when. I mean, however it happens, if it's going to happen, I'm not going to worry about it. But if it's going to happen, I want to know when. That way I have time to get everything in order. So let me ask you a question. Would you rather, which are you more afraid of? You just get to raise your hand for one. 1, dying. 2, losing your independence and having to rely on your family to take care of you for simple things like going to the bathroom. Which is more fearful? We'll say door 1, the yellow door, is dying. Raise your hand if you're more afraid of dying than the other one. No one raised their hand. Okay, raise your hand for number 2, the red door. Are you more afraid of losing your independence? I mean, that can mean a lot of things. That can mean you can't go to the bathroom by yourself. It can mean you lose your ability to drive. It means you might not be able to eat on your own or walk around. There's a lot of factors. So let me ask you a question. This is the part where I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I do want you to think. And if you have a piece of paper, I want you to jot down a couple of these answers. Where are you right now? At what age do you feel like you had your healthiest peak brain function? Write it down. You know when it was. And second question, has your brain function declined since then? Okay, now, here's where the questions get a little deep. How fast has it declined during that time period? Very, very slowly, or have you noticed just in the last year that you start to get fatigued, or you can't remember things, or you walk into the room to get that thing that you needed really badly, and then you get there and you're like, why did I just get here? And then you walk back to where you were, and you start, and then you see something, and then you get interrupted, and you do that, and you just are constantly losing your focus. All right, now, on a daily or weekly basis, do you notice that your brain function goes up and down? Are there times where you used to be able to read for an hour or two for pleasure, and now you read the newspaper for 10 or 15 minutes, and it just wears you out? You used to be able to get your reports done, focus, get it done, whatever it was, help your kids with their homework or help your grandkids with their homework, and now it just overwhelms you, and you're like, no, you just say no. The math's changed since I was a kid. Now, do you notice specific dysfunctions? We mentioned about memory. People like to joke about memory because it makes it not as shameful to forget, but memory is a really, really important thing. Like, we're making memories right now. A lot of what's happened today, you'll forget really shortly, and that's where our brain is designed to happen. But hopefully there's something that will pique your arousal to the point where you're like, hey, I want to remember that, and I'm going to actually make a commitment and follow through. And we'll talk a little bit about compounding effect and how that affects our brain. But have you noticed specific functions? All right. Do you ever struggle with bouts of anxiety, depression, sleep? Any sleep issues? Trouble falling asleep? I know, people are really smart. They have to solve all the world problems, world hunger, their family's problems, their children's problems. They have to plan everything they're going to do the day before, but they, as a result, sacrifice their sleep. And then there's the other group that just is so tired. They're fatigued. They've solved all the problems during the day. They go to sleep. 2 o'clock, they wake up wide awake, just laying there, ready to solve more problems. I have a patient who has history of OCD in her family and some of her children, but she has a specific temporal lobe manifestation where she'll actually just wake up in the middle of the night with a song in her head, and it's so loud in her head, not a real one, an imaginary one, that it just wakes her up, and now the song's so loud in her head that she can't go to sleep. There's other people with chronic pain. There's other people with blood sugar issues. So there's lots of reasons. So now you may be asking, if I only had a brain. That's what the scarecrow asked Dorothy. So how does brain function affect different phases of our life? It definitely affects our athletic performance. You know, you see, I'll sort of show the scale here. You can see at the top, when our brain's the healthiest, we have the best athletic performance. And then as our brain goes down, our athletic performance goes down. As our brain goes, so goes our body. And then what about our careers? When our career is at its peak, our brain function's usually doing pretty well. Now, you know, I'm in my late 40s. We'll say I'll turn 48 this year. And my brain is much higher functioning now, even now, than it was 20 years ago. I can focus longer. I can learn more. I get excited about what I'm doing. I can focus for long periods of time and teach people things. And sometimes my tongue can't keep up with how fast my brain's going. But how is my brain now different from a 6-year-old, where the 6-year-old has far more brain neurons than I have? What's the difference? What's the difference between my brain and with less neurons? We're losing neurons every day. That's the other exciting, cheerful fact for you. So what's the difference? The 6-year-old has a lot more neurons, but the connections are not as efficient. So my connections now, and most of yours, are better in some ways because your brain has gotten more efficient. So then what happens? As you start to get some aging, I've seen people in their 50s, early 50s and mid 50s with early onset Parkinson's, early onset Alzheimer's. And it's really, really sad. Because when you lose your memory and you don't know where the bathroom is, or else you're going to have an accident, that's a problem. So let me explain briefly on how simple the brain function is. Basically, all you need, see those 4 dots, those 4 ovals on the top? We need 4 things to help your brain function properly. The first one is you need oxygen. If you don't believe me, just hold your breath for 3 minutes and then we'll have a talk. It's really important to have oxygen to keep all your tissues functioning. The second one, we need glucose. So the first 2 count as fuel. We need oxygen and glucose, and then they go into the mitochondria, which if you remember from health class, I don't know if you remember the mitochondria. It looks sort of like a hot dog with a little squirt of mustard on it. I should have got you a picture, but you'll just have to visualize that one. Hey, have you noticed your visualization is not as good as it used to be? As you've aged? You should practice it. So the third component that we need in order to have healthy brain function is stimulation. That means we need to have activation of neurons. Neurons that aren't activated and aren't stimulated eventually die because the proteins that are required to maintain them functioning stop firing. And so there's genetics involved in this as well, but if you want to have certain brain regions last as long as they can, then you want to stimulate those. And then the final one is oxidative stress uncoupling, mitochondria. So that's a complicated 4-character terminology, which basically means how do we get rid of inflammation? So if you have good inflammation, eventually it will resolve, meaning you have an injury or an infection and your immune system reacts, T cells and B cells get activated, and then they take care of whatever the problem is, wind it up, and then they resolve. That's resolving or resolution of inflammation. If inflammation doesn't resolve after infection or doesn't resolve after an injury, then you're going to end up with a host of other problems, including brain degeneration, neurodegeneration, chronic reflex sympathy, complex regional pain syndromes, which is also known as reflex sympathetic dystrophy, and others. So if you want to make energy, that's ATP. You see the 3-character word right there? ATP basically stands for, we'll just call it the money. That's what the brain needs for money. So the other thing you need to understand with thresholds, this was where the nerve threshold needs to get to in order to fire. So when it fires, it's just like me pushing on the light switch very, very gently, gently, gently until, boom, I finally put enough force on and the light just goes off. and then I have to push it and just enough, and finally I click it and the light turns on. That's exactly how neurons work. They're all or none. But the threshold is what's the key, because when people are sick, they have less oxygen than they need, less glucose that they need, decreased stimulation, and a lot of us and our children have significant levels of inactivity. And if we don't get out and move, we don't generate energy for our mitochondria. If we don't generate energy, then something small like getting directions on how to get into this complex building could overwhelm your system. So when that happens, if you'll see here, the threshold is now closer to the negative 40 millivolts. And that means sometimes it'll fire just randomly on its own. So have you guys seizures is a perfect example of this. If there's been brain injury or sometimes genetic abnormalities, the thresholds are so close to firing that it just fires off, and then that will spread to other neurons, and that spreads to other neurons in a cascading magnifying effect, and pretty soon, if it's severe enough, then you just shut down the whole system because you overwhelm it by demanding too much fuel for too much firing. The thing about blood flow is we don't have enough blood flow to keep every system in our body perfused 100% of the time. Does that make sense? Has anyone ever had cramps at night in their calf? I hear that in pregnant ladies. I hear that in athletes. I hear that in neuropathy patients. I hear that in lots of patients who think they don't have any problems except for that. And that just means that the perfusion to those tissues is not maintained adequately enough. So there's a side-by-side comparison, healthy and unhealthy resting membranes. So this is a slide I got from Dr. Datis Karazian, and he is an amazing mentor and teacher for me, and he's taught me so much, but I just wanted to share that with you because when we talk about the difference between the brain and the gut function in just a moment, then you'll be able to refer to this. So let's talk about some symptoms. These are some signs of an unhealthy, or I created this little mnemonic, bad minds. It's a sign of bad brain. So brain fog, anxiety, and depression are by far the most common symptoms that I know of that are related to bad brain function. And there's others, memory loss, increased sympathetics. So what does that mean? We have a fight or flight system and we have a rest and digest system. In our fight or flight, it puts blood flow in certain areas and takes it away from others. If you have a high heart rate and a high blood pressure and decreased blood flow to your toes, really cold hands. I have people that tell me all the time, I said, look, you're cold, your hands and your feet, they're like ice cold. They said, oh, I've always had that. I'm like, well, guess what? You've always had poor blood flow to your hands, which by extension means you've always had poor blood flow to your brain. Because your brain, compared to the heart, is a peripheral structure. I mean, it is central, for one classification. But in terms of location, you need to pump brain. It's the number one consuming organ in the body. It consumes the most oxygen and glucose, 20%, and it's only less than a tenth of our body weight usually. So increased sympathetics, and then of course neurologic signs, dizziness, loss of smell. And there's also asymmetries. None of us have perfect faces, but in a lot of cases after a brain trauma, I'll see one side of someone's cheek lagging or a droopy eye, and I always want to look at pictures from before. Hey, is that eye drooping always been there, or is that something that's been recent? So then we get to the D, the poor digestive function. Simple. Constipation, which isn't usually life-threatening, but it's usually pretty uncomfortable. And then we have bloating, which usually is not life-threatening, but it is very uncomfortable. And gas, which for you is not as uncomfortable as it is if you release some for me. And then we have decreased enzymes and leaky gut. And of course, sleep difficulty. So, bad minds, you can remember that. It's a little bit complex, but hopefully that'll make sense. Now, would you like to see some of the signs and symptoms of unhealthy digestive function? They look really similar. Brain fog, anxiety, depression. Just ask yourself, when you were a kid, walking home from school, and you had an urge a really powerful urge, and you didn't have time to go back to school, you knew you had to make it home, and you felt those bowels needing to be relieved. Do you remember? Is anyone with me? Is this anyone had that experience? Yeah, you're feeling some anxiety. All right. So it's more of a sympathetic response. And if you're constipated, I see people all the time who have depression who also commonly have constipation. It's really common. Now, people who have stress-induced anxiety, like performance anxiety, I have a family member who I won't mention the name because this is being videoed, but she went through a long and grueling piano performance major, had to perform multiple times per semester, and then every year she had a 50, 60, 70-minute memorized performance she had to do, and it was basically 2 days before that performance. Now, she was stressed all the time. She was irritable all the time. She lost things and forgot things all the time, but her gut function really got bad 2 days before her performance. But somehow she was able to memorize over 100 pages of music with minimal faltering. So same thing. So I put the blue things in more like brain, and the red things in more brain, and then those blue ones, they all can affect all. So how do you protect what you value the most? Well, we know we can protect our heads with a helmet, but how do you protect your gut? I didn't create this image, but I did label it. Gut on fire equals brain on fire. Remember that. If your brain's inflamed, guess what else is inflamed? Your gut. And if your gut's inflamed, guess what else is inflamed? Your brain. And looking back, the symptoms are basically the same. So, what can you do to protect it? Well, let's talk about the gut for a minute. There's basically 7 main gut pathologies that I see and deal with, not by choice. I've been doing brain-based therapy, treating dizziness and brain injuries and balance issues, neuropathy for about 10, 15 years now. And just without me choosing it, people keep coming in with more and more of these issues, so I have to learn how to address them. But no one ever tells me when they just had a brain trauma, they just ignore the fact. I have to pull it out of them. Wait, are you having sensitivity to certain foods now? Are you having bloating in your stomach? Are you having acid reflux? Are you having reactions to foods? So there is a questionnaire that I will be glad to provide for all of you. This is just one section of that questionnaire, and you can give me till like Tuesday or Wednesday next week, and we'll get it on our website, but I'll let you go download the questionnaires, and you should fill it out, you and all your loved ones. There's one called Brain Function Assessment Form, BFAF, and then one called Brain Health and Nutrition Assessment Form. Go download those from my website, and then fill them out, and it'll tell you sort of where your dysfunction tends to lie. But if you have any difficulty digesting foods, or any trouble with inconsistent bowel movements such as constipation or diarrhea, that technically is an irritable bowel syndrome because it has this group of symptoms, but any of these things will tell us that you're having abnormal gut function, including an abnormal gag reflex. Any mothers who've brushed their teeth during pregnancy and just really had excessive gag response, that would be abnormal. And then there's others who, I actually stick a tongue depressor way down their throat, and they don't care. I mean, they don't like it, but they don't gag. And that's abnormal as well. So it can be too high or too low, and that's based on a brainstem. So if you have a gut dysfunction that's disrupted, you can have all sorts of other conditions. And what I found is there's all sorts of things like acne and dental issues and autoimmune disease and cancer and neurologic issues and eczema and psoriasis, all sorts of things that have a direct impact from disrupted gut. So what about brain inflammation? We call that neuroinflammation. All you'd have to do is just hit your head and have a brain trauma, or get totally inflamed in your whole gut, or have something like diabetes, or get exposed to toxins, or not have a diabetes but have surges of insulin that go up and down, and you can drive inflammation. Now, one more thing I'm going to teach you about brain function is that when nerves get inflamed and infected, they usually decrease their function. So like if you've known, if you get an inner ear infection, a lot of times the nerve on that side will shut down. So, and when you have an imbalance in your vestibular system from one side to the other, it will create sometimes a tilting, sometimes a spinning sensation. So inflammation over time will eventually destroy neurons. How does that happen? I just showed you. When the neuron's threshold gets so close to firing, and then it just starts firing automatically, and eventually, every time someone has a seizure, they're losing brain neurons at a higher rate than they would have. You don't have to raise your hands, but just think, if you've ever had a migraine, it's just one step away from a seizure. Every time you have a migraine, you're losing brain neurons as well. So you want to do everything you can to prevent these kind of dysfunctions, especially things that make it so you can't endure what you used to be able to do, like focus and read and understand. Brain fog is something I see so commonly in concussion, but I see it so often in anxiety and depression as well. So I was chatting with a few people out in the lobby there, and they mentioned they were interested in concussion, so I put this slide in just so you can be, on guard for yourself or someone else. Now, concussion is basically a constellation of symptoms, and it can be, basically it's mild traumatic brain injury. And under the traumatic brain injury category, there's mild, moderate, and severe. If you have an MRI after a concussion and it's negative, yet you still have symptoms, you have mild traumatic brain injury. I have another talk. If you're ever interested in having me talk to any of your groups on concussion, I'd be glad to do it. I have a talk specifically on concussion and how we treat it. But you need to know that concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, and sometimes brain injuries can go away in a week, and sometimes they can go away in 3 months, and sometimes most of them go away in about six months. But what if you're the 10% who doesn't go away in 6 months? You don't know in advance what you're going to be. But the things I'm going to teach you today will help you prevent or make yourself less at risk to get a concussion if you have an impact. So there's 4 basic categories: physical symptoms, cognitive symptoms, sleep symptoms, and behavioral symptoms, emotional type symptoms. So if you have brain fog, or you just can't remember things, or you're having slowness, or you have speech difficulty, then that's more on the cognitive side. If you have physical issues with headaches and vomiting and balance and light sensitivity, those are all on the physical side. Loss of coordination. And every one of those things that I just read to you tells me what brain area was injured. If you're sleeping too much or too little, or you just have chronic fatigue, it's really common with concussion. I had a patient who emailed me, actually texted me yesterday while I was at the golf course, and I had given her some products that would help her sleep, because she just had 3 concussions in like a week. One, her horse knocked her down, then she hit a beam in a low basement, and then she hit something else. I lose track of how they hurt themselves. And she called me up and says, since you gave me that thing, that supplement, I've been just really tired, and I just feel like I need to sleep 12 or 14 hours. I feel like I'm so lazy, and I said, no. She said, well, maybe it's because I'm so old. I said, no, it has nothing to do with laziness or being old. It has everything to do with when you have a concussion, you need to rest more, and you need to be able to rest more. And if you don't, you will slow down your recovery, and you will end up with other symptoms going with it. So how does the gut and the brain communicate with each other? Now I'm done with my introduction. So we're ready to get into the meat of it now. So if you see, the brain has a bidirectional communication with the gut through specific nerve pathways called the vagus nerve, and it's getting more and more common and more famous in health circles to talk about vagal stimulation. And there's something called the Polyvagal Theory, which I mean, I'll just tell you, the more I learn about the gut and the brain, anytime someone tells you they have the one answer that's going to fix it all, I just run, because it is so complex that there's no just one answer. So if you tell me afterwards, and when you ask a question, I just want to know the one thing I need to fix this significant complex problem, I'm going to say, I don't know. It all depends. It might be one thing, it might be 5 things. If you're really motivated, you might have to do 10 things or 15 to get your brain and your gut to heal. If you just have a small dysfunction, maybe it only takes a couple to make you come back to normal. But you'll see over on that right side, those things called cytokines, opioids, peptides. These are amino acid chains that basically the gut communicates it to our brain with. Now, there's also a neurologic hardwired pathway that goes back and forth, but there's also chemical and we'll just call them chemicals. They're basically neurotransmitters, chemical neurotransmitters that communicate from the gut to the brain as well. So I got a picture of the vagus nerve for you. There's a left and a right. And you see it just goes to a few places, all the way from the larynx to the lungs, to the heart, to the liver, to the stomach, pancreas, colon, kidneys, all the way down to the very last, basically the last section of the intestine is the only thing it doesn't go to. And I was challenged to say the word sphincter at least 5 times in this lecture, so we're about to start that right now. So let's talk about a couple of the sphincters and how they're controlled. And the ladies just walked in, and they're wondering what we're talking about now. So that's a picture of the stomach. We have something called the lower esophageal sphincter, or the gastroesophageal. That's that top area, and that needs to constrict so that food doesn't go out after you've eaten a meal. It also needs to open so food can get in there. But at the bottom, there's also a duodenal sphincter, which sort of holds the food in the stomach in that bag so it can get mixed and slurried together, mixed with the enzymes, so that then it can start to go to the next section of the digestive tract. And then if you look down, track that gallbladder up and around and down to where it joins the pancreas, and you'll see that there's a sphincter of Oddi. If you can remember that, if you ever have a board exam, that will come in handy. But that's the common duct for the bile and the pancreatic enzymes to go out. So all these sphincters need to contract and relax. That's the whole point. There's a time to relax and there's a time to contract. There's a little closer section from the inside, and it's all, see that muscle there, that smooth muscle? That muscle needs to have control. What's the control that the brain gives it? Through what nerve? Not the one down in Nevada, but vagus, V-A-G-U-S, the vagus nerve. So that controls it all. So here's another sphincter or valve. You see the small intestine, that thinner tube goes down and over, and then right where it joins the large intestine, that's where the ileocecal valve is. And all these valves need to be controlled very tightly. Open and close, open and close at the appropriate times. Now, this one's specifically important because, has anyone ever heard of the condition called SIBO? S-I-B-O? So SIBO is a small intestinal bowel overgrowth. And basically in our large intestine, that bigger area, that bigger tube, we're supposed to have bacteria in there. But in the small intestine, we're not supposed to have any bacteria. So if we get food going down and the valve opens and it's ready to go into the large section, but then it doesn't close, and then we got a mixing and a regurgitation of food, partially digested food, with bacteria into the small intestine. And there's a lot more small intestine in terms of feet, maybe 37 feet versus 3 to 4 feet of large intestine. And so once it gets back up and it goes around that corner and it can't come back, then pretty soon you have a reactivity. And these, as you know, we talked about this earlier, these parts of the gut, these bacteria create gas, methane or hydrogen. Neither of them smell very good when they're mixed with putrefying proteins and so forth. But if that gas is being secreted from the bacteria in the small intestine, then you have bloating that happens. And there's really no way to get that gas around. It just starts to hurt. And you know that there's tests that you can do. The research is mixed on whether you should do a test or whether it's called a urea breath test. But the research is showing that if you wake up in the morning and your stomach's flat, and then you eat and eat and eat 3 times, and then by the end of the day, your stomach is like you're 6 months pregnant, you probably have SIBO. And you need to fix that. Otherwise, you will cause potentially danger and harm to your brain and your intestine, your gut. Now, when I say gut, I'm not talking about, like Santa Claus, this belly sticking out. When we say gut, we mean everything from the digestive tract, basically, from the pharynx all the way down. So we talked about this. Neurotransmitters, do they affect our mood? Do they affect our brain chemistry? Do they affect our ability to fire? Do they affect our ability to feel satisfied when we eat? To feel the appropriate signals? Not feel hungry after I eat? It's really important. So I have a little messed up situation here. And I have a patient who, this is a great case because this also lets me talk about some really important whiplash things. So let me just tell you, if any of you have a truck or an SUV and you have what are those things on the back called? Trailer hitch. I actually remember this. I just wanted to see if you guys are with me. Trailer hitch. So if you have a trailer hitch but no trailer and you get rear-ended, your car, since you're in the truck that has the trailer hitch, looks pretty good, right? Because that solid steel doesn't get bent. The person who hits it, they get a lot of damage. So which would you rather be in, the person who's hitting the trailer hitch, or would you rather be in the car that gets hit? If you care about your body and your brain is what I'm asking, not just your car. So raise your hand if you'd rather be hitting someone. If you had to choose, you only have to choose one. Okay, you'd rather hit somebody. All right, raise your hand if you'd rather be in the car with the trailer hitch. Some of you are not voting, but a little more voted for trailer hitch. You need more time. She needs more time. So the way physics work in brain chemistry and soft tissue injuries is that when a force, think of Newton's cradle. My grandmother used to have one of those things with the 2 fishing lines and the steel balls, and they're clicking back and forth. When the force gets transferred, if you're inside that steel ball and the ball is not injured, that means you get bounced around all the time. Okay? So that means you're potentially going to have more soft tissue injury if the car has no damage and absorbs no force than if your car gets a lot of damage. Does that make sense? So if you have a trailer hitch, take it off. Some of the worst concussions I've seen, no car damage at all. They just got hit on their trailer hitch. And this one case, concussion, 6 months later, I see him. This kid is 21. He's suicidal. Doesn't want to go to work. His mom brings him in, and he had this concussion, but no car damage. And basically, here's what happened. And I had to drag this out of him because he wouldn't admit it. Like 21-year-old boys don't want to talk about poop. And so let me explain what happened in this case. So you have a traumatic brain injury. That's the top box there. And then you also have a confounding factor which makes you more likely to have a brain injury. It's called the standard American diet. It's really sad how most of us eat. And then down in the second box, when you have a brain trauma, what happens is you suddenly have an increased demand for fuel. But within 6 hours, you have a dramatically decreased blood flow. So you have a increased demand and a decreased supply. And it's just very apparent. It's a gap. But yet you still want to go to work. You still need to go to school. You still need to take care of your family. And so you have a mismatch. More demand and less fuel. And what that means is your brainstem can't do what it's designed to do. The brainstem and the pons and the medulla where the vagus is located start to shut down. The lower two parts of the brainstem, there's three parts, upper, middle, and lower. Can you guys remember those? Upper, middle, lower. I won't even make you name them. The upper is more for your sympathetic system, and your middle and lower are more for your blood flow and relaxed. So he suddenly stopped having valve movements every day, started feeling more bloated, started feeling nauseated all the time. Really wasn't hungry, but he was still eating. He was in a habit. And then all this coordination activity that's supposed to occur from the vagus stopped happening. So gut motility, do you want to know what one of the first signs for having, when your gut slows down, meaning maybe it completely stops. We sort of have this nice rhythm going on in our gut all the time. If I listen with a stethoscope on your gut, I'll find that you have little sounds and different little dolphin and whale chirping noises going on all the time. But when your gut motility goes down, do you know what one of the first signs is? One of the first symptoms? Nausea. Nausea is a brainstem. There's an area called, I won't even name it. There's an area in your brainstem that controls nausea. And if your gut stops moving, it makes sense that you wouldn't want to just keep eating a lot more food to put it in. So you lose your appetite, your constipation, and then you can potentially get bloated. And after that, look what happens. We just talked about all the valves. The valves need to close and open at the right time, but the food's not really moving through very much, and now your valves are now sort of shutting down. We've got our gallbladder valve, the ileocecal valve, all the ones that we talked about. And then at that point, now you have some other things. You're supposed to secrete enzymes to digest that food. And your ability to squirt that organ and push that down through the valve is now decreased. So your gut's not moving. Your brainstem's not sending blood to where it needs. Your brainstem's not even sending blood flow to the gut that needs the blood flow to stay alive. And you lose your ability to digest just three things: protein, carbohydrates, and fat. That's everything, by the way. Everything. And then you continue to have decreased parasympathetics, which decreases more blood flow, and pretty soon you have leaky gut. And I'm not talking about a chubby guy with a faucet coming out of his belly. It's leaky gut means you're now absorbing proteins, and you shouldn't be absorbing them. Now, one thing you need to know to understand the link between the brain and the gut is that the blood-brain barrier has the same proteins between the endothelial cells that are the proteins that keep the gut tight. So you can only absorb the small proteins and not have a major immune reaction. So if you have a brain trauma, I didn't put any studies in this talk because I thought it would bore everybody, but it's really exciting when you see a mouse model and you see a piece of the gut and they take a stain and you see those junctions nice and tight together, and then 6 hours after the concussion of the mouse, you see the gut villi come apart and the junctions are coming apart. So that means these proteins called occludins and zonulins are now sagging apart, and you're absorbing things into the bloodstream, from the bloodstream into the brain that you should never absorb. Here's a picture. Tight junctions and leaky and inflamed junctions. Basically, toxins and large proteins should never be going through. They should just be going right through out to the toilet. But if the gut is leaky, are you guys following me now? I mean, I heard about leaky gut first 20 years ago when I was in chiropractic school. And one of our teachers, he asked everybody to get research for extra credit. And all he wanted research on was leaky gut. And so 20 years ago is when I first heard about leaky gut. Now I actually understand what leaky gut, and I really thought it was leaking out of the final sphincter. That's what I thought leaky gut was at first. But you see, when those toxins and those organisms, bacteria, viruses, parasites, get into the channels there and they absorb, about 80% of our immune system is lying right there waiting for an alarm system to happen. And if you visualize the Great Wall of China, back in the 5,000 years ago, they had sentries posted at each of those, every few miles down at the guard towers. And when they would have some invaders, maybe it was the Huns or who knows, they would light a torch. And then the one a few miles down would see that torch, he'd light it. And so they'd let each other know that there was invaders coming in. The immune system's the exact same way. It lets each other know that more invaders are coming in and we have to react. So what can cause us to have an increased immune reaction to normal things? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, at least 7 things. Our diet's a big one. Certain medications we take. Speaking of medications, does anyone know what the most commonly prescribed and apparently taken medication is in 2010? Number 1 and 2. 50 bonus points if you know what this is. Prescribed. So we're going to go with prescribed because ibuprofen's probably up there on the over-the-counters, but on the prescribed. No. Oxycontin? Luckily, no. But it's a lot. And I didn't bring my top 100 medication sheet in this, but number 1 is Nexium. Acid suppressants. We'll say all the acid suppressants. Okay, acid suppressant medications. Number 2, any other guesses? None of those that you said are any of them that is number 2. None of the ones you just said. It starts with an L. Yes, cholesterol lowering medication. It usually ends in statin, except for Lipitor doesn't end in statin, but it's a statin. So we got diet, medications, infections. You don't want a brain infection, I guarantee it. A lot of the studies in the recent literature is showing post-mortem studies of Alzheimer's, they're finding parasites, spirochetes in the brain. And guess how it gets there? From the gut. And it shouldn't have even got into the bloodstream or up through the vagus nerve because our gut should be healthy and keep it out. Stress is a really big one. Hormonal variations and fluctuations, dysregulation, neurologic injury, and then metabolic problems. Things like diabetes, gut inflammation. There's just a whole bunch. So basically we have a whole bunch of mechanisms, things that are just going against us that can cause us to have dysregulation. And if our gut is leaky, that means our barrier is not safe. We're not safe. Did you guys lock your door into your house last night when you went to bed? What are some other barriers that you can think of? We have the gut barrier. I'll give you one. There's at least 7 more. You call it out. Blood-brain barrier. Very good. We talked about that one. There's 2. Another barrier. Important. They're all really important to keep infections out of us. Skin barrier. Very good. You guys are thinking now. Come on. Liver barrier. I haven't heard of that, but it's part of it. Mucous membranes. Very good. Lymphatics. Lymphatics doesn't have easy access, but yeah, it could be counted as a barrier. You've heard of the blood-brain barrier. What about the placental barrier? Have you ever heard of that? Certain medications can go across it, certain can't. And then one more that I just learned about a year ago called the blood-nerve barrier. It's just like the blood-brain barrier. It's surrounded by certain cells, little endothelial cells, and it shouldn't let things in. So a barrier is just like a screen in our window. It has different, there's different grades and sizes of screens with different openings, or it could be considered a fence. I saw a funny, like a chain link fence, that's a barrier too, right? So there's a flood coming in a guy's property and he has a bucket, he's standing inside his yard and he's dumping water on the other side. Sometimes you feel like that with your health, don't you? So yes, the barrier will allow certain things to come through and others to not. The flies can get through the chain link fence, but hopefully they don't get into your house. So leaky gut syndrome can lead to a lot of things. Malabsorption, food sensitivity, dysbiosis, and we have we're perfectly on time. We have enough time to cover all the things about how to fix it. So there's a lot of dysfunction and all these sort of go to each other. One affects the other and the other affects the other. So about 9.3% of patients with celiac have SIBO. And if you look down there where it says irritable bowel syndrome, about almost 80% of people with irritable bowel syndrome have small intestinal bowel overgrowth. 90% of alcoholics, and I really doubt that this is accurate because I see, well, maybe it's inaccurate because I see more sick people in my office, but I'm thinking it's like 30-50% of the elderly population seem to have gut dysregulation at least. So we talked about SIBO. You eat the sugar, the small intestinal bacteria, which shouldn't be in the small intestine. Are you guys following me? That should be in the large intestine, which is sort of the last disposal area for our waste. Once you have the small intestine have bacteria in it, it will either form methane or hydrogen based on the type of bacteria. And if it forms methane, then you have decreased gastrointestinal motility, meaning things slow down. And if you have hydrogen, then you have diarrhea or increased motility. It moves too fast. And I don't know, I like this chart because it makes sense. And sometimes people have a little bit of both. Have this one day, have this one day. And no, basically if you treat SIBO and get the gut biome in the right place and give people the right digestive enzymes and then activate their brain so that their gut can be controlled and coordinated like it should, they get better. A lot of these SIBO cases just resolve. So this is another thing that brings it all together. It shows, okay, raise your hand if you think that burning and reflux is caused from too much acid. Raise your hand. It's either too much or too little. I'm not going to turn it on you. So too much acid causes reflux. Raise your hand. Too little acid causes reflux. All right. Some of you still aren't voting. A little more of you are on the low acid side, but the majority in this room knows that most reflux, and acid reflux particularly, is caused from a too low acid. So if you cut down the ability of the stomach cells to make acid, then you no longer absorb proteins and digest proteins properly. You no longer kill viruses and bacteria that get in your gut properly. And so you are then just going down the SIBO track. All right, so raise your hand if you'd like to know what we can do to support the brain-gut axis. Good, you're still with me. So I think we have at least 15 minutes to go over this. Good. So I always ask my patients, how much do you want to do? How deep do you want to go? Because it's easy for someone when they have a cut and it's bleeding to know that you need to put a Band-Aid there. But if you have a symptom that is far away from that, people just aren't as excited to take action. So if you had any of those symptoms on my Bad Minds acronym sheet there, then you might want to consider some of these strategies. So we can treat the brain and the gut and just do that for a few months. I usually can see things change in 6 months, sometimes as much as, or 6 weeks, sometimes as long as 6 months, and sometimes more. But we can treat the brain to talk to the gut better. We can treat the gut to talk to the brain better, or we can do simultaneous. Does that make sense? Might as well treat both, especially if they're fun. Some of these exercises are fun. So I like the simultaneous option, but I have to break it down and teach you separately first. So let's talk about some brain-gut axis support things. So on the left side, so this is basically teaching us how we can activate the brain and the gut. And it's basically these three things that I use, plus these down here. So if we want to activate the brainstem, specifically the vagus nerve, one goes right down and right behind our SCMs here. I actually can get a probe and I can push your muscle away and I can stimulate it. It works pretty well. But there's things you can do at home. So I'll teach you those. And there's also eye movements you can do because these brainstem neurons are all in a column. And if you activate one neuron nearby, it'll activate the others. So stress reduction, really important. We'll go away from that slide for just a second, and you'll see all the effects of stress on our gut. It's sort of like when you have a brain injury. The same exact thing happens. You have decreased GI motility, decreased enzymes, decreased immune function, too much bacteria, and more biofilms. And biofilms, does anyone know what those are? So sometimes when you have like a parasite or some other infections, they create these little hideouts, and they put this little protein web across the top so that when your immune system goes to survey around, it doesn't see them. It's like military hiding under a camouflage net. And so if you have more stress, you get more infections that promote and cover themselves with biofilm. So when you treat it, even with an antibiotic, sometimes the antibiotics don't even touch that bacteria because they're hiding behind the biofilm. So you have to actually decrease your biofilms and sometimes do it in different phases in order to get the bacteria to go away. So back to this. Stress is really important. The research is showing two really important and effective, in several studies, these two things to help reduce stress. One's called gut-directed hypnotherapy, and you can search for that on the web, and there's a website called helpibs.com. And I was going to put it there, but I ran out of room. Helpibs.com sort of goes through and explains how to do it. And there's meditations and hypnosis tapes that you can buy, or CDs, or I don't know how you do it. I've never done it, but I just learned about it recently, and it's going to be something we're going to consider. But it showed basically 75 to 80% resolution of IBS in the study. I was like, wow, that's way better than any medication. If you take a medication for IBS and you get a 20% benefit, they're excited. It helps you 20% have 20% less symptoms. You're having severe constipation and diarrhea, and you get 20% better. Now you just have it 8 days out of 10 instead of every single day. Your success. And the other thing is something called a body scan. So have you ever done progressive muscle relaxation, where you contract a muscle and then relax it and contract, and you just sort of work up? This is sort of like that. You basically imagine yourself in an MRI or a CT scanner, and you just sort of, like a laser, just sort of like you're going through a vertical laser, and you just sort of focus on each of your different body parts as it goes up, and you just relax it as it goes along. And it's actually very beneficial for IBS and helping your gut heal. So those are something you can try. Breathing, really important. You need more oxygen. I teach a specific breathing ratio. I mean, this is so simple that you probably shouldn't do it, because it's just too simple. And it only takes a minute, so it probably takes too much. Most of you are probably too busy for it. So I'll just teach it anyway. But basically, you breathe in for 3 seconds without elevating your shoulders. You just breathe in quietly from your belly, and you blow out for 6 seconds, and you make a little shh sound, just like that. And you do that 6 times. It takes about a minute, and then you're done. And you do it again another hour or two later, and then you do it again another hour or two later. And you'll be so surprised how it dampens your stress. And if you get good at it, within 30 seconds, you'll feel peace and gratitude and sensations you haven't felt in a while when you're upset. There's another type of breathing called Wim Hof. And have you heard of Wim Hof? He's I forget where he's from, but he is from some Eastern country, and he's basically set the world record for underwater, the longest time underwater under a frozen lake. He set the record. He got the record, 7 minutes. And he said he would have done it longer, but his corneas froze up, so it made him a little anxious. So his friends were there at the top of the hole, I guess, waiting to pull him out, but he was good. So basically, with Wim Hof breathing, it's more of an aggressive style of breathing, so you never want to do it while you're standing up or driving, but you basically breathe in. Do that about 40 times while you're sitting down or lying in bed, and you just keep going. And after about 10 or 11 breaths, you will forget how to count, because your lips will start to tingle, you'll feel a little lightheaded. And the way you can tell this actually helps you have a better control of your nervous system is you can do a little thing called exhale breath holding. So let's just do it right now. Stand up. This won't take long. So you're going to breathe in, blow it all the way out, and then you're going to hold your breath as long as you can, and then you sit down when you can't hold it anymore. Go. Sit down when you cannot hold when you have to take your breath, just sit down. So we got someone at 9 seconds, and 10, 11, 14, 15, 17, 19. Most people are getting down now. 23. Keep going if you can. 26. 30 seconds. 32. We got a few stragglers at 37, 39, and 43. Okay, one person left. And 47 seconds. Okay, pretty good. Most people who are have too much acid in their body can't do that for more than 15 seconds. If you can do it over 30 seconds, it's pretty good. And there was a lot of you that could, so that's good. You guys are the healthier crowd. I never have a patient that can do it. I rarely have a patient that can do it more than 30 seconds. So what you'll do, you don't have to do this now, but try this tonight. So we already just timed you. You heard your number that I told you. So you go home tonight and you sit in your chair, do it with some of your kids or your husband and test them first. And then you're going to do the breath holding after you do 40 of those breaths. And you'll be so surprised. When I did it my first time, it was 35. I did 40 breaths, then I held for 1 minute and 5. And then I did it again, 40 breaths, and then I held for 1 minute and 30. And then I did another 40 breaths, and I held for over 2 minutes. And so you're just driving off carbon dioxide at such a high level that you create, it's like you're controlling your autonomic nervous system in a cool way. So it will make you less prone to infections. It will help you, you just feel like you're in control because your brain actually has more of what it wants, which is oxygen, more oxygen and less carbon dioxide. So I've had patients with gut issues do that. So is anyone going to try that tonight? Good, try it. And then you got to write it down because you won't remember. Believe me, when you start, I'll ask your question in just a minute. I'll answer your question in just a minute. But when you forget, you just will forget. Your brain is like in a different acidic state. And if you have any, doctors have warned you not to do that, then don't do that. I'm telling you just as a health test. Just try it. But doing the relaxed breathing 5 times a day, 10 times a day is profound. If you have brain fog, it will help you calm down. If you need to add the more aggressive style of Wim Hof, if you're really you get up in the morning and you have no energy, try this. It'll energize you. You won't feel like it, but after you're done, you'll be like, I never had someone tell me they wish they wouldn't have done that. I just really regret spending that 40 breaths. It'll take a minute or 2, 3. But you just do full in, all the way out. A bellows breath, just like that. 40 times. Count on your fingers or else you're going to lose track. Okay, so we're going to talk about vagal activations in just a second, but I want to just briefly mention the regional activations, which are really important. It's mainly what I do in my office, because I'll have you fill out your brain function form and I'll do your history, and then we fill out I basically take what I think are the top 3 areas of your brain that are dysfunctioning, even if you have gut problems. Now, most people come to see me for brain issues, and then we find their gut problems along the way. But what I've started to see happen a little bit more is people have gut issues, and then we find their brain problems along the way. Doesn't matter which one you start. They both affect each other. So let's talk about at least 5, 6 exercises, 5 procedures and 1 treatment that you can do to activate your vagal nuclei. So singing in the car or the shower, great, do it. Sing loud, and it will activate your vagus nerve. Sing it for a minute, sing for 2, 5, whatever you can do, because if you drive that system in the pharynx, it will help even yawning will help. See, she just yawned. I'm talking about the vagus, and she's now ready to activate it. So singing loudy. Now, when you gargle water, take a cup of water, take a half sip, tip your head back, and gargle. See if you can do it for 10 seconds. It's harder than you think. And then do it again. Gargle for 10 seconds, and then do it again. If you can gargle at least a minute or two several times a day, you're activating your vagal nuclei, which will help you with your gut. So I'm not asking by show of hands who has gut symptoms, because it could be embarrassing, but I'm teaching you some of the things you can do to support this system. So you can also buy a box of tongue depressor blades on Amazon, and you just stick those slowly along the back of your tongue until you get a nice, powerful gag response. And then you can do it on the other side. Sometimes I'll diagnose you and tell you, oh, you're worse on the left or the right. And that will help you know. When you get a gag response, you should get a tear response as well. This is one of those situations where the neurons are in columns, and so your gag response should cause a tear response as well. And if it's not, then you might want to stimulate it a little bit more. So tongue swallows is very simple. Stick your tongue out. You can try this right now. Tip your head back, keep your tongue out, and swallow. Close your lips on your tongue while it's protruding, and then try to swallow. It's pretty hard. Try that 5 times right before you go to bed. It's one of my sleep apnea exercises that I teach people. If you have sleep apnea or you feel like you can't breathe well during the night, sometimes that helps drive that respiratory center. I won't talk a lot about coffee enemas because I've never done one, but I hear it's helpful for vagal activation. So you can read about that on the internet. And then we do lots of laser, cold laser and vibration and specific stimulation with a probe of these different nerves. And basically our goals, as I show, we want to increase motility so that the gut moves not too much, not too little, just in the right amount. And we also increase the ability of our sphincters to close when they're supposed to be closed and fully open when they need to be open. As we do this, we'll increase our blood flow to the intestines and definitely improve our blood oxygen delivery, and then we can improve the communication from our brain to our gut. So the last thing I want to talk about is basically something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a peptide that's secreted by the brain, but it basically helps your nerves grow and communicate with each other. And does anyone know how you stimulate that? Pretty much the only way you can stimulate it if you're not a developing toddler. Exercise. So you can exercise, but you have to exercise with enough intensity to have it have a function. You guys recognize any of these vegetables? So that's sauerkraut on the right with apple. And then you've got some kimchi on the left and the right. Kimchi on the right. And then you have something on the left called sauerraten, I think is the name of it. I should have wrote it down. I just learned about it recently. But it's basically pickled turnips. And then over on the right is an El Salvadorian dish called curtido. And this is basically leads us to our last of our gut-brain strategies, which is in order to help the gut function at its best, we need to have fermented foods, sour reuben, yes, there it is, sour reuben, curtido. And then we need to have high fiber foods. Now, on the far right, you'll see where it says prebiotics and FODMAPs. For some cases, we need those, and for other cases, we have to avoid them. But on the high essential fatty acid foods, things like olives, fish, sardines, avocados, olive oil, all those things provide healthy fats. And then in certain cases, we have to tell people to avoid certain starches because they have SIBO and they have reflexive swelling of their digestive system. So medium chain fatty acids are high in coconut oil, and that's basically like jet fuel for your gut, and grass-fed meats. The corn-fed salmon and corn-fed the cows, they just do not produce the kind of high essential fatty acids that we need. And then the last 2 slides we have here, basically to support from a supplement side, we need plenty of hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes to help our digestion go right. And magnesium is really important to help decrease inflammation. And then we need to take glutamine at several grams a day usually to help heal the gut, and vitamin D to help dampen the immune system. The difference between the gut and the brain immune system is the gut system has something called the T regulatory cells, and that will dampen immune inflammation. But the brain has microglia, and there's no dampening system. So vitamin D is really important to help decrease brain inflammation, along with the essential fatty acids we talked about a minute ago. And then on the probiotic side, any one of these, I could do a whole hour or 10 on each one of these topics, but I wanted to just make sure that you guys knew that these are the supplements that we use to help treat these. And you just have to check on the dosages to see what makes a difference for you. And just because you need a certain low dose of one may mean you need a really high dose of the other. And then the key is you want to avoid neurotoxins. Avoid things like nitrites and MSG. Avoid aspartame. And this is also like a concussion prevention protocol. Avoid sucralose. It's in Gatorade. Avoid, as best you can, high fructose corn syrup. But these are toxins that do cause neuroinflammation, which by extension will cause gut inflammation. You know, I have this case that I told you about earlier, the one who got rear-ended with a trailer hitch. About a month after I saw him, I saw a young man by the name of Lincoln, and his mom came in, and he was about 15, hadn't seen him in a few years. And I saw him, and he just was really just not with it that day. And I asked him, you know, Lincoln, I measured his rib expansion, and it went from 99 to 97. And I said, hey, what was your rib expansion from 99 to 97? He says, I'm not good at math. I said, well, 9 minus 7. He goes, no, I just don't do well under pressure. I don't like. And his brain really wasn't firing. And I told his mom, we got to get his gut healthy. We got to get his brain healthy. Let's get him in next week again and do some things. Well, he didn't come in the next week, but the next Tuesday we got a really sad phone call from his grandmother, who had said that he'd just taken his own life. And I mean, this is a lot of science. I like it. I love helping people get over and heal from brain injuries and gut injuries, but I don't want any more of those kind of phone calls. And the mom, when I saw her at the funeral, she runs up to me and she just hugs me and cries and says, I should have got him in to see you. I should have got him in to see you. I said, no, we can't blame ourselves for anything. All you can do is try to be part of the solution and not contribute to the problem. And so that's what I encourage you guys to go out and do. Take responsibility for your health and make a difference in your life and the lives of your loved ones. Thank you.